Imagine you are walking through a city you have never seen before. The streets are made of packed earth, smooth from 10,000 footsteps. The air smells of pine resin burning in clay lamps, of lacquered wood warming in the afternoon sun, of salted fish drying on bamboo racks somewhere around the corner. You are in one of the great cities of ancient China. Not the China of emperors and dragons you may have seen in paintings, but an older, stranger world. A world where China does not yet exist. A world where 7 kingdoms are locked in a century-long struggle for survival, and where the most powerful men on earth live behind walls so high they seem to hold up the sky. You stop at a gate. It is enormous. The timber columns on either side of it are painted red, a deep, almost arterial red, and the paint has been renewed so many times that the wood beneath it has lost all grain. Above the gate, a row of ceramic tiles curves downward in the style that will one day define Chinese architecture for 2,000 years. But right now, in this moment, it is simply the gate to a nobleman's compound, a minister's residence, a general's house, and nobody outside it fully knows what is behind it. Most people who walk past this gate every day of their lives have never been inside. Most people never will be. And that is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the interior world of the Chinese nobility during the age of the 7 kingdoms. The Warring States period, that extraordinary convulsion of war, philosophy, and transformation that lasted roughly from the 5th century to the 3rd century before the Common Era. What lay behind those walls was not merely a house. It was another country. This is what we are going inside today. Not the palaces of the kings. Those have been reconstructed and reimagined countless times. We are going inside the world of the great ministers, the powerful aristocratic clans, the hereditary lords who held entire territories as their private domains. We are going inside the compounds that shaped Chinese culture in ways that are still visible, still felt, thousands of years later. And we are going to see it through the eyes of the people who lived there. Not just the men who owned it, but the hundreds of lives that existed within those walls, invisible to history, present in every detail. To understand what these interiors looked like, you first have to understand what they were for. A nobleman's compound during the Warring States period was not a home in any sense we would recognize today. It was a machine. It was an administrative center, a military headquarters, a ritual space, a place of production, a center of political intrigue, and a household, all compressed into a single walled enclosure that could stretch across an area larger than a modern city block. Some of the largest ministerial compounds in states like Qi, Chu, and Wei were effectively small cities within cities, with populations of servants, guards, artisans, cooks, scholars, musicians, concubines, children, horses, and animals numbering into the hundreds. The compound was organized around a series of courtyards. This is one of the defining features of elite architecture in this period, and it will remain so for the entirety of Chinese history. You did not walk into a great house and find yourself immediately in the main hall. You entered a sequence of spaces, each one filtering you, each one communicating your rank and your purpose before you had said a single word. The outermost courtyard, just inside the main gate, was the most public. This was where petitioners waited, where merchants delivered goods, where messengers arrived breathless with news from distant battlefields. Guards stood here. Stewards moved through it with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned exactly how to seem busy while watching everything. The gate itself deserves more attention than it usually receives. During the Warring States period, the right to build a gate of a specific height, width, and ornamentation was not a matter of personal taste. It was a matter of law. Ritual texts that were already ancient by this point. Texts that would eventually be compiled into what we know as the Zhou Li and the Yi Li, specified with extraordinary precision what kinds of architectural elements corresponded to what ranks of nobility. The number of steps leading to a main hall, the depth of the eaves, the number of pillars visible from the street, the color of the roof tiles, even the width of the approach road. All of it was encoded. A great minister was entitled to certain proportions. A lesser official was entitled to less. Building beyond your rank was not merely tasteless. It was a political act, a claim to status, potentially an act of treason. This matters because it means that even before you crossed the threshold of a nobleman's compound, the building was already speaking to you in a language everyone in that society understood. The architecture was a public statement of legitimacy, of rank, of the exact position the owner occupied in the hierarchy of the known world. And inside, behind those walls, a different language was spoken. A private one. The transition from the outer courtyards to the inner buildings was a transition between registers. The outer zones were formal, public, carefully controlled. As you moved inward, the spaces became smaller, more intimate, more layered. The main reception hall, the Ting, was the central ceremonial space where the Lord met officials, conducted business, received guests of rank, and performed the rituals that kept his household in right relationship with heaven, with the spirits of his ancestors, and with the political world around him. These halls were large, open structures, their roofs supported by interior columns, their floors raised on a platform of rammed earth that elevated the Lord above his visitors in a way that was both practical and deeply symbolic. The columns were lacquered, the ceiling beams were carved, the floor was covered with woven mats arranged according to rules that specified exactly where each person should sit based on their rank, their relationship to the host, and the nature of the occasion. Lacquer is something that deserves an entire explanation of its own because it shaped the visual world of the Warring States elite in ways that are difficult to fully imagine unless you have stood in front of a piece of it in a museum and looked at it properly. Not at the display card, but at the object itself. Lacquer in this period was a luxury of extraordinary cost and extraordinary beauty. It came from the sap of the lacquer tree, refined through a process of filtering and heating that took weeks, then applied in layer upon layer, sometimes a dozen layers, sometimes 30 or 40, each one dried in conditions of precisely controlled humidity before the next was added. The process was so painstaking that a single lacquered vessel could represent months of skilled labor. And these were not rare objects in a great nobleman's household. They were everywhere. The cups from which wine was drunk were lacquered, the food vessels, the storage containers, the musical instruments, the furniture, the screens that divided interior spaces, all of it lacquered in deep blacks and vermilions, decorated with patterns of cloud scrolls and dragon forms, and geometric interlace that seem almost electric in their energy even today. Lacquerware found in the great elite tombs of the Chu Kingdom, tombs that are among the most spectacular archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, shows us objects of such technical perfection that modern craftsmen have spent decades attempting to understand how they were made. The colors have survived 2,000 years underground with almost no fading. This is what surrounded a nobleman of rank as he sat in his reception hall and received his guests. The seating itself was a performance. There were no chairs during the Warring States period. That furniture form arrived in China much later from Central Asia via a long process of cultural exchange that had not yet begun. Everyone sat on mats on the floor. But the mats were not equal. The quality of the mat, its material, its border, its thickness, communicated rank. The position on the mat, whether you sat in the formal kneeling position or allowed yourself to relax, communicated relationship. Who sat facing south, the direction of yang energy, of authority, of the Lord himself. Who sat facing east, who was placed slightly further from the center. These were not subtle signals. They were understood immediately and precisely by everyone in the room, because everyone in that world had been trained from childhood to read these codes as fluently as they read written characters. Wine arrived in lacquered cups, carried by servants who moved through the hall with a specific, trained silence. Not merely quiet, but deliberately, culturally silent in the way that a great household required. The wine of the Warring States period was not the clear grain liquor of later Chinese culture. It was a thicker, less refined drink, often described in texts of the period as having a turbid, slightly sweet quality, made from millet or rice and fermented in large clay vessels that were stored in the cooler back sections of the compound. Drinking during formal occasions followed its own ritual choreography. Who was toasted first? How many times the cup was raised? In what direction one turned before drinking? Get it wrong, and you had not merely committed a social error. You had disrupted a ritual order that connected the living to the dead, to the cosmos. The ancestors were not metaphorical presences in these spaces. They were architectural ones. Every great household maintained an ancestral shrine, the Zong Miao, that was in many ways the most important building in the entire compound. This was where the spirit tablets of the deceased members of the lineage were housed, where sacrifices of food and wine were made on a regular calendar of ritual occasions, where the living members of the family came to report major decisions and seek guidance from those who had gone before. The tablets themselves were inscribed with the names and titles of the dead, arranged in a hierarchy that mirrored the hierarchy of the living world. The shrine was not a place of grief, exactly, but it was a place of obligation, a constant physical reminder that the family existed not as isolated individuals, but as a link in a chain that stretched back through time and would stretch forward into a future that depended on correct behavior in the present. Moving deeper into the compound, past the main hall, you entered the residential zones. And this is where the physical world of these great households becomes most difficult for a modern eye to reconstruct, because these are the spaces that left the fewest traces. The sleeping chambers, the private apartments, the quarters where the women of the household lived. These were built of lighter materials, were more frequently rebuilt and renovated, and were considered too intimate, too private, to be described in detail in the texts that have survived. What we know comes from scattered literary references, from objects found in tombs, from the occasional archaeological discovery that preserved a floor plan or a foundation. What we can say is that these inner spaces were organized around strict gender separation that was perhaps the most fundamental architectural principle of the elite household. The outer court, the nan, or south sections, belonged to the men. The inner court, the bay, or north sections, belonged to the women. A great minister's wife did not appear in the reception hall. She did not meet his political guests. She governed an entirely parallel world within the same walls, a world of silk production, food preparation, education of children, management of the inner household staff, and the maintenance of the ritual calendar that kept the family in proper relationship with all the powers that mattered. The silk in those inner rooms was not incidental. Silk production was one of the primary economic functions of an elite household in the Warring States period, and the women of the household were not merely supervisors of it. They were expected to participate in it, to demonstrate through their own hands the virtue of productive labor. The texts of the period held up as the female equivalent of the military or administrative service expected of men. Silk looms were large, complex, loud pieces of equipment. The sound of them in operation, a rhythmic, heavy clacking that could be heard from a surprising distance, was so fundamental to the soundscape of a functioning household that its absence was sometimes noted in poetry as a sign of decline or disaster. A household where the looms had fallen silent was a household in trouble. The silk itself emerged in patterns of extraordinary complexity. The Warring States period is, among other things, one of the great eras of Chinese textile production, and the silks that have survived from Chu tombs in particular, preserved by the unusual chemistry of those burial environments, show designs of such intricacy and color that they still seem almost impossibly sophisticated. Geometric patterns, bird forms, dragon interlace, cloud shapes, rendered in threads of yellow, red, green, brown, and black, woven on looms that required years of training to operate. This was the material world of the inner quarters. Not soft and domestic in the sense we might imagine, but skilled, productive, economically significant. The kitchens of a great household were in a category of their own. They were substantial structures separated from the main residential buildings for the obvious reason that fire was an ever-present catastrophe waiting to happen in a world of lacquered wood and silk hangings. The kitchen staff of a major minister's compound could be surprisingly large. Cooks who specialized in different methods of preparation, people responsible solely for the storage and management of grain supplies, specialists in the preparation of ritual foods that required knowledge of a specific sacred cuisine. The bronze vessels in which food was cooked and served were among the most symbolically charged objects in the entire material world of the period. The number and type of bronze ritual vessels a lord was entitled to display was, like the gate, a matter of law and rank. The famous Ding cauldrons, the great three-legged bronze vessels that appear in every museum collection of this period, were not cooking pots in any ordinary sense. They were statements of legitimate power, objects that connected the owner to the ritual order of the Zhou world and to the authority that descended, however attenuated, from the Son of Heaven himself. This is also the period when extraordinary tensions were building around precisely these symbols of legitimacy. The Warring States era is called that for a reason. These 7 kingdoms were consuming each other slowly and then with increasing speed in a series of wars of absorption that would ultimately leave only one state standing. And the great noble households were caught in the middle of these wars in ways that were intensely personal, intensely physical. A lord whose state was conquered did not simply retire. His ancestral tablets were at risk. His lineage, which had accumulated its compound, its ritual vessels, its silks, its archives of administrative documents over generations, faced the possibility of complete erasure. The compounds themselves sometimes survived conquest. Practical men needed functioning administrative centers, and a building was a building regardless of whose name was written above the gate. But the content of the compound, the ritual objects, the records, the living members of the family, these were subject to the brutal calculations of political survival. The histories of the period are filled with accounts of great families that simply vanished, their lines extinguished, their compound walls reassigned, their bronze vessels melted down or redistributed to the new lord's ritual spaces. The ancestral tablets that had been the living heart of those inner shrines were destroyed, and the spirits they housed were left without offerings, without memory, without the ritual sustenance that was thought to be necessary for their continued existence in whatever realm the dead occupied. This is the shadow that hung over every great household in the Warring States period. All the lacquer, all the silk, all the bronze, all the carefully maintained ritual calendar, all of it existed against a background of potential obliteration. And people knew it. The texts of this extraordinary century of Chinese philosophy, Confucius, Mencius, Mozi, Zhuangzi, the legalists, are in many ways the intellectual response of a world that was watching its existing order collapse in real time. The compound walls that we are trying to see inside today were also walls against that collapse, attempts to preserve in physical form an order that was becoming harder and harder to maintain. The gardens of these compounds deserve their own moment of attention because they were not ornamental in the way that later Chinese garden design would become. During the Warring States period, the open spaces within an elite compound served multiple functions, some ritual, some practical, some that combined the two in ways that are hard to separate cleanly. Trees were planted at specific positions relative to buildings for reasons that were simultaneously aesthetic, cosmological, and practical. A mulberry tree in the courtyard was not just a tree, it was the food source for silkworms, a living part of the household economy, and also a symbol of domestic virtue so ancient and so embedded in the literary imagination of the period that it appeared in poetry and political discourse alike. Medicinal herbs grew in kitchen gardens tended by women who possessed knowledge of plant properties that was itself a form of power. The ability to heal, to regulate the health of a large household, to know which plants combined dangerously and which could be used to manage the chronic illnesses of a large population of people living in close proximity. Water was present in ways that ranged from purely functional to architecturally elaborate. The great compounds needed wells. multiple wells, because the water needs of hundreds of people and animals were enormous. But water also appeared in the form of small pools or channels in the more elaborate establishments, particularly in the states of the South and East, where wealth and climatic conditions made such features possible. These were not the elaborate pleasure gardens of later dynasties. They were more modest, more purposeful, but they suggest an understanding of water as an element that could organize space aesthetically, could create cooling in summer, could provide a focus for contemplation in the inner courts, where the women of the household spent much of their lives. Contemplation was not a passive thing in these spaces. The inner quarters of a great household were also its intellectual archive. The women who managed these spaces were, in the most educated families, themselves educated, capable of reading, of understanding the ritual texts that governed household life, of teaching their children the lineage histories and moral lessons that would shape the next generation of officials and aristocrats. The transmission of knowledge within elite families during this period was not solely a formal or institutional matter. Much of it happened in exactly these inner spaces, in conversations between mothers and children, in the memorization of poetry and precedent that was considered essential preparation for public life. The light in these inner spaces was different from the light we're accustomed to. Windows in warring states' architecture were not glazed. Glass windows were not part of Chinese architectural vocabulary in this period. Light entered through doorways, through latticed openings in walls that could be covered with oiled silk or woven screens in cold or wet weather, through the open courtyard spaces that the rooms surrounded. The light was therefore variable in a way that shaped life. Brighter in summer, dimmer in winter, always mediated by the screens and hangings that served as both insulation and decoration. Lamps burned animal fat or vegetable oil in clay or bronze vessels, and in the great houses, the quality of the lamp, the material of the vessel, the stand it sat on, the shade that directed and filtered its light, was another marker of rank and wealth. One of the most remarkable aspects of life in these compounds, and one that is almost never discussed, is the acoustic world they created. The walls that provided privacy and security also created an environment in which sound traveled in particular ways, through courtyards, down corridors, bouncing off the lacquered surfaces that covered so much of the interior. Music was a constant presence in the life of an elite household. And again, this was not merely entertainment. Music, in the intellectual world of the Warring States period, was understood as a moral force, as a technology of cosmic regulation. The great Confucian texts that were being assembled and debated in this very era argued that correct music, music in the proper modes, played on the proper instruments in the proper proportions, was essential to the maintenance of social order. The court musicians who served in a great household were therefore not merely performers. They were, in a sense, technicians of harmony, both literal and social. The instruments they played were known from both textual descriptions and archaeological finds. The qin, the 7-stringed zither that will remain at the center of Chinese elite musical culture for the next 2,000 years, was already present in this period, already associated with the cultivation of inner virtue that the educated elite were supposed to aspire to. But the great ritual music of the time involved larger ensembles, bronze bells in elaborate sets, each bell tuned to produce 2 distinct tones depending on where it was struck, hung on elaborate wooden frames that were themselves works of art. The famous set of bells discovered in the tomb of Marquis Yi of Zheng, buried in 433 before the Common Era, is perhaps the single most extraordinary musical instrument ever found in any archaeological context anywhere in the world. 65 bells of precisely tuned bronze, still capable after 2,500 years of producing the music for which they were made. Sets like this, somewhat smaller but similarly elaborate, would have been among the most prized possessions of a great household, housed in a specific performance space and brought out for ritual and ceremonial occasions that marked the calendar of the aristocratic year. The bodies of the people who lived in these spaces were themselves regulated, maintained, and adorned in ways that were inseparable from the political and ritual life of the compound. Dress was as strictly codified as architecture. The quality of silk, the color of the garment, the design of the embroidery, the materials of the belt and the various ornaments worn hanging from it, all communicated rank, function, and occasion with a precision that required years of training to fully understand and navigate. The jade objects that appear in such quantities in the tombs of the warring states' nobility were not primarily jewelry in any decorative sense. They were statements, amulets, markers of virtue. Jade being understood in the moral philosophy of the period as a material that embodied the virtues the noble class was supposed to embody: hardness, luster, smoothness, the ability to produce sound when struck. The way its color seemed to live within the stone rather than on its surface. Healthcare in these compounds was a field of genuine sophistication, though it would be unrecognizable by modern standards and devastating in its limitations. The medical practitioners who served great households in the Warring States period worked within a theoretical framework that was already highly developed: the understanding of the body as a system of flowing vital energy, of the relationship between the organs and the seasons and the emotions and the moral state of the person, of the use of acupuncture and moxibustion and herbal preparations to restore balance when illness indicated that balance had been lost. This was not superstition in any meaningful sense of the word. It was an internally consistent system of understanding the human body, developed over centuries of observation and refined by practitioners of real intelligence. Its limitations, above all, its inability to understand the role of infectious agents in disease, made it catastrophic in the face of epidemic illness, which struck these dense, walled compounds with terrifying regularity. Plague, dysentery, smallpox. These moved through the crowded servants' quarters of a great household in a way that the medical technology of the time could do almost nothing to address. Death was therefore close, constant, and domesticated in a way that modern experience cannot easily accommodate. Children died. Concubines died in childbirth. Servants died of illnesses that should not have been fatal. The ritual calendar of mourning, who wore what, for how long, for which relative, was another one of those vast systems of encoded information that governed every aspect of life in the compound. Mourning dress, mourning diet, mourning behavior. The period of ritual grief for a parent was 3 years, during which the bereaved person withdrew from normal life, ate simplified food, wore undyed hemp garments, avoided music and ceremony. This was not merely personal, it was political. A great official in mourning could not perform his public duties. The state had an interest in the grief of its nobles. The libraries of these compounds, if that word is not too anachronistic, were another dimension of life that is easy to overlook. The written records of a major ministerial household were extensive. Administrative documents, contracts, ritual calendars, genealogical records, copies of important texts that the household had acquired or commissioned. These were written on bamboo strips, the primary writing material of the period, before the widespread use of silk as a writing surface, bundled together with silk cords and stored in chests or hung on the walls of the record rooms. The texts of this period that have survived, often found in tombs where the bamboo strips were protected by the burial environment, are a reminder of how rich and varied the literary culture of the Warring States was. Legal documents, philosophical treatises, medical prescriptions, military manuals, ritual instructions, administrative records, all of it was produced, copied, stored, consulted, and argued over in exactly the kind of household we have been exploring. What is perhaps most startling when you step back and look at all of this together is how thoroughly the compound created a self-contained world. A world with its own economy, its own social hierarchy, its own ritual calendar, its own aesthetic culture, its own archives of memory. The nobleman who sat in his reception hall, receiving the carefully arranged visitors who had been filtered through 3 courtyards to reach him, was not merely a private individual in a house. He was the center of a universe that was both an extension of the state and a potential alternative to it. This was the tension that made the great noble households simultaneously indispensable to the political order of the warring states and, ultimately, threatening to it. As the wars intensified and the surviving states became larger, more centralized, more bureaucratic, as the old hereditary aristocracy began to be replaced by appointed officials who served at the pleasure of the king rather than by right of birth, the great compound began to change its meaning. The bronze ritual vessels that had announced the legitimate rank of their owner became politically ambiguous objects. The ancestral shrines that connected a family to its past became potential monuments to a claim on power that the new order did not intend to recognize. The walls that had kept the outside world out began to feel, for some, less like protection and more like the walls of a trap. The conquest of one state by another did not merely change the flag over the city gate. It reached inside the walls of every great compound and rearranged the relationships of power that had organized life there for generations. The steward who had served his master's family for 30 years suddenly had to calculate whether his loyalty was a virtue or a liability. The musicians who had played the ritual music of a lineage now played for a new master whose ancestors they did not know. The women of the inner quarters, who had organized their lives around a ritual calendar connected to one family's dead, found themselves in houses where new tablets had replaced the old ones in the shrine, and the objects themselves, the lacquered cups, the silk hangings, the bronze bells, the jade pendants, were redistributed, melted down, repainted, or buried. Many of the most extraordinary things we know about the life of these compounds we know because they were placed in tombs when their owners died, preserved underground for 2 millennia while the world they came from vanished. The people who put them there understood, perhaps, that what they were burying was not just the dead. They were burying a way of life. History, when it is written, tends to write about the wars, the conquests, the names of kings, and the dates of battles. But the people who lived in these compounds, the minister who sat on his lacquered mat and watched the seasons turn in the courtyard garden, the woman at the loom who heard the bronze bells ringing from the shrine at the far end of the outer court, the child memorizing the genealogy of dead ancestors whose faces had never been painted. These people were not thinking about history. They were living in the only world they knew, attending to the 1,000 specific, ordinary, extraordinary details that filled a day in one of the most elaborate social environments humanity has ever created. What they could not know, what no one ever knows, living inside a moment, is that the world they inhabited so completely, that they maintained with such care and such effort and such devotion to its codes and its rituals and its beautiful objects, was in the process of ending. Not in a day, not in a battle, but slowly, across their lifetimes and their children's lifetimes, in the grinding logic of the wars that gave this age its name. The 7 kingdoms would become one. The great compounds would become administrative offices. The ritual vessels would be melted for coins or weapons. The ancestral shrines would grow cold. But for the moment, in the lacquered light, with the silk looms turning, with the bronze bells tuned to harmonies that were supposed to keep the cosmos in order, the world behind those red walls was complete and intricate and alive. And the people inside it had no idea they were already part of history. If this is what it looked like to live in those lost mansions of the 7 kingdoms, in the last generations of a world that was about to be replaced forever, then the next question might be stranger still. What happened to those objects, those rituals, those ways of understanding the world when the walls finally came down? What survived the unification and what truly vanished?